Welcome everybody to a new edition of Sato X Live. We're not even waiting for people to come in. We're just starting it off the riff. Today's episode came as a not so much as a surprise, but more of an answer to a problem that we thought we would never have, and that is the problem of just trying to be a digital user in the Web2 world, right? So there's this idea that everything is client and server. And today we're going to be focusing more on the client side, right? The experience of the person using Web2 and how that differs from Web3. And hopefully next week we're going to touch on the reverse of that topic, right?
Yeah.
So, we don't really think about it, but, the way we use apps today is heavily influenced by the architecture underneath. And, this has a lot of advantages and disadvantages, but, an open internet architecture does not function in this client server manner, right? And the reason for that is because we don't have no centralized office. There is no central point where everybody can get their data from, right? And this has a lot of advantages when it comes to things like non-excludability, which is very important in a true and open internet, which is what we're we're all about. Um, we were at this point where we're thinking, okay, Web2 is maybe more convenient, and Web3 maybe has a bit more friction. But during the course of this episode, I think we'll come to the realization that things aren't exactly like that, at least not anymore. So today we're going to talk about these differences and, hopefully we'll get a better understanding of the perceived pros of Web2 and the perceived cons of Web3. Am I on point there, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, I've long been pointing out that like this kind of presumption that it's harder to do things in quote unquote Web3 is maybe a little off base. And I think some of it stems from the idea that like cryptographic keys look menacing, the 50 odd character strings. And so people are assuming, well, that makes it harder to use. Which I think we'll get into whether that's really the case or not. But I think also one of the key things I see in this space is, people love their iPhones because they're easy to use. They love their Macs because they're easy to use. I've never been an iPhone or a Mac user. So to me, if I'm asked by a Mac user to help them do something because I'm a computer guy, I look like an idiot because I can't even find how to do the simplest things like switch between apps or find something in the file system or anything, because it just seems backwards to me because I'm a Linux user or an Android user and I don't get how their thing works. So I think there's a bunch of stuff at play here, and some of it is about what people have become used to. And where that's different to like the just plain, like which ecosystem do I belong to kind of thing, is that I think also then there's a bit more to it with the kind of what became Web 2, like the kind of as the corporate internet took shape, they saw the power of kind of grooming and melding the expectations of users to match what those companies did and how they made money. So they took basic things like login or whatever, and they started looking at, well, how do we make this suit us, right? Maybe intentionally, maybe not, depending on the company and the mode, but we kind of progressed in that way. And so what we've got is a lot of stuff where it's assumed that that's what it has to be, or this is normal, or this is how you do it. But actually it's come about because in a world of options, companies chose self-serving solutions because they were better for the company. And that's even in a Web 2 world, it's not necessarily the way you have to do it. But, it's become the accepted thing. It's what people expect. And so we have this very interesting mix of genuine technical things, change in understanding how things work, and then also overcoming how things have been pushed on people, how people have like been kind of trained to think about interfaces and stuff.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is that you're not a big fan of continue with Google or continue with Apple as a login mechanism, or because that's kind of like what the internet has become, at least in recent
Mm-hmm.
years. No matter where you go, no matter what you want to do on the internet, you kind of have to start by creating an account. You
Mm-hmm.
need an account in order to participate. And this kind of implies that you kind of have to give away your identity and data to a third party before you even can get through the door, right? It's no longer a question like, oh, look, we built something, have a look at it. If you like it, maybe become a member or pay for it or whatever. It's just like, you want to come in, you gotta use the account. And two questions pop up from this. Question number one, which I think you kind of answered there to begin with, which was, why does it have to be like this? And the second question would be, how does Web3 change this paradigm?
Well, I think it's on that first question, I think it's really interesting, and you can see the answer by looking at the different flows in different places. So, where there's a lot of competition and where there's multiple options, and you could exit the flow to purchase or whatever at any time, what you tend to see is continuous guest and then allowing you to go, put stuff in your cart, coaxing you to, like get right to the end. And at the end, they're like, oh, do you want to create an account with these details you just gave us? Because what companies that are doing that have learned is don't piss off the user, right? Don't put any friction in front of them. Let's get them to purchase what's in their cart first, and then we'll try softly to bring them in and make it easier next time or whatever. So obviously that's possible. You can go all the way through a shopping experience without logging in and finish it without logging in. There's lots of flows where that works. But what you can see is there are a lot of places where that would work, but it's not an option. And that tends to be where either the provider just doesn't have any competition, so they know you have no choice. You're here, you need my stuff, right? So a classic example, I nearly threw my phone at the wall the other day dealing with like Ticketmaster and like ticketing, and I'm having to install their app and do things to like see the QR code for the ticket I bought, which they could have just emailed to me. But because it's a monopoly provider, the league who run the sport that I wanted to get had tickets to just gave them the rights, then I can't go anywhere else. So they're going to make me do that, and I have to fill in forms and tell them who I am, like you're saying, because they know they can just get that out of me, and they're going to try and use that to try and sell me tickets to other things, and that they know they can do that. Whereas it's obviously possible because I buy other things and I go all the way through the process without logging in, without creating a UID, or anything like that. So I think you can kind of see even in Web2 flows that this is optional. And what's happening is it's a very, very specific choice on the part of the provider to decide how much they can get away with in terms of inconvenience you, etc. Because if they're worried you'll leave, they'll be as careful as they can be to minimize all that friction, etc. So I think that's the kind of first part of it. And then moving on to the second part of what you're asking about, I think it's just become this assumption that you need, because people log in so much to so many things, it's become a kind of instinct to not even question, why am I doing that in this case? And so people assume if I'm going to have a permanent identity on this site or whatever, I have to log in, etc. And it's quite funny because that's not at all true. A friend of mine created a World Cup site where we're going to basically bet on the games, and the winner takes some money and knows the other guy's beers or whatever. And he built it with Claude, and it just gave me, it was like, oh, if you want to like run this on another device, here's a code for you. Just enter this code on another device, and it will give you access to your tips so that you can update them or whatever. And I thought about it, I'm like, that's perfectly secure, and there's no login here, etc. As a completely different mode of working. And Claude did that in that case because it was like, well, what's the minimum effort I have to put in to let this guy build a secure enough login system for these like 5 mates who are going to bet on the World Cup with each other, right? It didn't need to be banking secure. It didn't need to be crypto secure. It was just like, okay, they need so that someone else can't come in and alter their details. That's it. This code will do it. And that's really interesting because there's so many modes and stuff. But what's happened is we've been pushed into this idea as soon as you do anything online, as soon as you're typing anything into the internet, you have to have an account. And it's become so ingrained in people that, in fact, like if they're using apps that don't require that, people start to feel nervous or confused or whatever.
It's also this idea of convenience requires surrender. Like if you want things to go smooth, you just have to give us all the keys, and you kind of have these like two or three big what would I call them? They would say service providers. I would call them like fiefdoms. You'd
Mm.
have like login with Meta, login with Apple, and login with Google,
Yep.
and that's
Well,
pretty much like which one's your master.
well, that's the thing is that like that's the ultimate victory for those guys because they've won it on both sides, right? They're getting people who third party software and experienced developers like handing over their ability to to take users' identities to a third party. And yeah, that's completely absurd. But I think part of the issue as well is it's a bit like, used to talk to people about Chinese medicine, like, and it has these awful flavors, right? Like it's almost as if now if you made a new one, you'd have to make it taste like dirt or people wouldn't feel like it's real, right? I think there's a kind of mental association with if it doesn't taste terrible, it can't be good medicine, right? And so I think people feel like that with security. If it's not a pain in the ass and if it isn't involve all these weird steps, then I don't feel secure, right? And so that is then played on to like request, oh, what's your date of birth? When like that's no relevance to the system whatsoever, but people probably fill it in because they're like, well, I'm logging in, I'm creating my account, I should tell them that. And
Yeah, I
there's no
always
need.
exactly. I always had a problem with that because I never really gave my date of birth, but I would always have to think like, what's the fake birthday I have to give so that in case I need to recover my password and they ask me for my date of birth, and to remember usually I just go 1st of January and then just some random year that I choose all over the place. But I agree with you that it's I think it's more in terms of like a psychological exercise to see how much you'll put up with,
Mm-hmm.
and based on what the people respond, they just tighten the screw or loosen the screw and say like, oh, sorry, it was an accident. Or I know there are companies who actively push more and more control over their users, and then they say like, oh no, this was just like a test we were doing in this region. But the
Mm.
test is like, how far can we push you? That was the test.
Yeah.
you know so yeah, it's a very it's one of those things where you wonder how newer generation will deal with it because they have no experience of what the internet was before.
Well, I think it's also the app generations, right? So it's all well and good for graybeards like me to talk about, oh, back in the day when you SSH'd, you telnetted into the bulletin board and then you typed, whatever. And seeing people's experiences developing from there. But I think, like someone who's 20 now, if they started using the internet when they were 12, that was 2018. So there are, that's, yeah. So that's, like not um, that's not someone who came along with bulletin boards and dial-up internet. That's someone who came along years after Facebook was popular and to OAuth across websites existed, etc. So yeah, they're probably very quick and happy to say, oh, well, I'll just use the one login for everything, and also totally inured to the idea that things happen in apps. And so I need to have a login, etc., because it's convenient to be able to pop the app open and do whatever I want to do. And so they just, they've just never experienced anything else and they accept that that's how these things work.
Exactly. And there's this whole thing where everything is gated and nothing is local, right?
Mm-hmm.
it- as little as possible should be on your phone. Everything has to be in the cloud. If you ever think about switching platform, well, tough luck, because that's not gonna go smoothly. And
Mm.
it just hits me that it's probably the most fundamental difference between Web 2 and Web 3. The fact that there's so much friction if you want to do something outside of what the platform wants you to do, or if, God forbid, you have a link to your own website, which is somewhere else, that's a no-no. Or you post a link in a comment, that's a no-no.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this sort of like behavior. I think the best example was, with Substack on Twitter. Was this investigative journalist, which had a lot of help from Elon when he took over. But as soon as that guy started his own Substack, he just got shadow banned because that meant he was taking people off Twitter, and that was a big no-no.
Mm-hmm.
And it just hits you that, you know it's kind of similar to banking, right? The moment you want to do something that you want to do with your money, and the bank doesn't want you to do that, suddenly it's like, oh, it's for your own protection, and it feels like you're just being babysitted into just making the right choices.
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to what we're talking about with the friction and whether, organizations feel they'll get away with it. And the simple truth is that people have gotten so used to the idea that you know, people just accept, without thinking, oh, the site has to have moderation, right? You have to have that. And they haven't necessarily thought through or entertained other models, um, which there are some, for managing content or being happy with the experience, et cetera, et cetera. And so people just assume, oh, there has to be some central rule setter, there has to be some central authority, and they get a combination of browbeaten, but also just trained to understand, like, don't anger. It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz, don't anger the thing back there behind the curtain that just shadow bans you or penalizes your post or whatever. And so people sort of learn things like, yeah, don't link out on X or Twitter because, it'll cause you problems, which is absurd. And I mean, it's not like there's no group of people. There's a significant portion of the population who've left social media that's doing that. But I think for the most part, people are just sort of internalizing that sort of stuff, especially if they're younger and they're just living the experience. So they just sort of internalize, oh, platforms want me to behave a certain way. I need to do that to keep the platform working smoothly. So I'll just do that. And it's quite insidious when you think about it, and it's amazing how well accepted it is.
Yeah, and you also think about this. The whole idea of terms of service, right? I wish I could have my own terms of service,
Mm,
so that when Instagram interacts with me, they have to accept my terms. It's always the other way around. I always thought this was really funny how
mm.
companies can have these terms of service where they pretty much take over everything, but you cannot do the same to them. That's, oh, whoa, 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 buddy, that's too much. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, we've all had that fantasy, you've heard about the lawyer in the US or whatever who like writes back saying, by the way, I'm going to charge you $250 an hour for future correspondence on this matter. We all dream at some point in our lives, I think, of being able to do that, or think, how could I execute something like that in this case, where we know our time is being wasted or we're just being subjected to some set of rules that aren't like reasonable. Um, but yeah, it's just accepted that, and I don't even think the fact that they know people just scroll through and so they just hide stuff in there is the worst bit. It's just the acceptance that I have to accept that kind of thing, and it's not possible to say, why don't we just Don Draper this and like not have a contract and see how we go, which is, I think, how a bunch of normal human interactions work, and they work plenty fine until you hit like the criminal or whatever. You can have relationships with people, get to know people, interact with them without having a term of service about how that's going to happen. But somehow you're on the internet, and again, I think partially because of that assumption that there's some kind of necessary central authority, and then therefore they have to have that authority. So it's reasonable that they create a rule book or a set of laws for us to all obey when we're on the platform. But it's just generally assumed that that's a kind of reasonable thing to have, but it's also then, used, um, way beyond anything like a code of conduct to sudden, if you go and look at what's actually in there, I mean, very little of it's about that. And a lot of it is about things like who gets rights to the content on the site, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's almost inevitably shoehorning that stuff in. And, there's a few exemplary companies out there who have great terms of service that like are very thoughtful and helpful. But for the most part, it's as much of a one-way, street as they can make it.
How would this how would how would this relationship change in a Web3 environment for the user? Let's say, you're on Sato and you're using Red Square, right? How would that experience from the ground up change the rights and the leverage that the user has?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, thing that occurs to me anyway, and this is interesting, even in the way you phrase that, right? It kind of has tones of the way this sort of thing is talked about, where people are like, how would you ever do that? Like, how is it possible? It's like, we have phones, right? And like we SMS each other or we make phone calls to each other without there being this kind of thing where the first thing we do is like set up like terms of service, etc. We're not expecting it in a huge swathe of interactions, including digital ones, where we don't expect that, right? And so it's hard to imagine a social platform like Red Square that looks a lot like a Twitter or a Mastodon or something. It could, not have a terms of service in that sense, but it's opt-in and it's a group of peers and you can behave how you want there. Now, if I or we as a project run a Red Square server, I reserve the rights to make sure it's not propounding stuff that I think is awful, terrible, I don't want to be putting out there. And I have to make a decision if someone's arguing things that I don't like, whether I think that's, an issue or not. And me being me, it's rarely going to be an issue until it gets to the point where there's, certain things that I would just say, well, you can't put that up there. That's my server. It doesn't mean that like we shut down the phone network because one guy yelled something racist on his phone, right? We don't shut down the phone network for that. Hopefully anyone who's talking to him either gives him a piece of their mind or just hangs up on him, right? Because he's an idiot. But that's, or engages productively, tries to help him out. But that doesn't mean you like look at the underlying layer and say, well, we should shut that off or ban someone from it or whatever. And I think we have it's not just analogies, we have modes for dealing with this stuff societally and in other pieces of tech that we use every day. We're just so used to the way these things are provided that we expect them to be, gate kept and moderated, etc. So the simple answer is you can manage the people you talk to. You should have the tools. Like Red Square would be terrible if you couldn't manage who you're seeing and what you're hearing. And no one would want to run a front-facing server that publishes stuff if it had to publish everything, and no one's going to make that happen. But you can have a system where that's the choice of the server operator and that's the choice of the people on the forum about what they want to do there. And it's peer-to-peer. You manage it as individuals and you manage it as a community. And we have thousands of examples of how to do that, whether it's our local church or the school or the park or whatever, where as a society we manage this stuff. And I think that's something that people miss. So my hope is the difference and the experience you get is it's actually kind of weirdly more organic. Maybe not what you're expecting because it looks like an online experience and you have some presumptions about how that will be. But my hope is for users in the end, it's more human and it's more organic and it feels more like interacting with people at a party, in an office, at a business meeting, at a pub, depending on the crowd and why you're there, that it has that kind of feeling.
Right. So like the most I guess would be to no longer the TLDR would be no longer be accept that there has to be a third party to come in and fix what you want to see or how you want to interact with one
Right.
another.
Well, I think, yes, to TLDR it a little bit, use an analogy. If there's a pub, right, you expect the publican to keep the pub safe and friendly, but you don't expect the publican to come and listen in on every conversation around every table and decide what's allowed to be said and what's not, right? That's not their point. If people are getting rowdy, if they're causing other people to be scared or whatever, sure, the publican or the bouncer is going to step in and say, hey, look, that's not, I run this pub and this is my set of standards. But you don't expect them to be leaning over the table waiting for someone to like breach the terms of service of the pub. That's literally, I think, where we've gotten to in other kinds of communal spaces. And so part of what Web3 should be about is just turning that back into something we already have good social methods for dealing with.
I think that would work really well as a social experiment to just have a pub where there's like, employees of the pub just like hide behind every table corner, just listen in just to make sure, exactly, just eyes
I feel
peering
so
over
sorry
the edge
for
of the
them.
table, just to listen in just to make sure everybody's behaving. Because maybe then people will get a better understanding what is actually happening. Because right
Well, I
now we
mean,
think about it like it's not there.
we're making jokes about it, but genuinely imagine. I mean, I've been to. There was a period in New York where I think it's because of smoking or something, but they made a lot of bars turn into private clubs. So the minute you walked in the door, you had to sign something and give them $1 so that you're a club member, so that people could smoke in the room. Because if it was a public bar, you couldn't or something. Anyway, it was like for a short period of time. But imagine if you walked into the door at any bar or pub or whatever, and like someone said, here's the terms of service, gave you a 15-page document you had to sign at the bottom, and then you spent your whole time in there worrying that someone was going to come up and say, oh, no, I overheard you humming a song you don't have the digital rights to. Out you go.
We're joking, but I think we're like a few years away from that. I'm not like, the way I hear you saying it, I'm like, oh my God, somebody's having that business idea right now. What if we could just listen to people in bars, and if they hum the song, we can charge them for that.
Yes,
Um, because it feels like we're in that timeline. It feels like we're in that timeline.
well, I think that's the reason that this sort of having these discussions is important and interesting, because you start feeling that things are absurd, and after a while you're like, well, at what point, like, how far down this absurd path have we gone? And I think it genuinely is the case where we're laughing, but if you go back to the case of that being an online exchange and I did hum the song, actually you can imagine that would happen, because people's YouTube channels are forever being automatically DCMA'd for, like, the ice cream van passing outside plays an Oasis song, and suddenly, right, the YouTube channel's taken down because they were pirating music. It isn't actually that far from what's going on.
And I think like this example that you just gave kind of circles back to something that you've said over and over again in various editions of the Open Internet Pod, which is that the moment you centralize something, you kind of create this point where, third parties have an interest to use it, whether that's a database or whether it's a way to game the system to squeeze more money for like YouTube takedowns or copyright claims on videos that, like you said, have a ban in the background. You kind of create this economic incentives for people to do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic thing. I was at an online meetup today, and we ended up talking about age verification and stuff, and how much of a honeypot that is to hackers, right? It's the same with, you can now use, this happened to me, a DCMA based phishing attack, right? So you get so used to the idea that these things are real that you respond, right? And you're thinking, well, I didn't music on the podcast. What's that about? But it creates, like you say, the existence of this central authority then creates these weird modalities to leverage that to attack in various ways, whether it's money extraction or an attempt to phish or hack someone or whatever. But that wouldn't be possible if it was a peer-to-peer network, and I just didn't think that thing existed.
Exactly. And just because that happens to you, we know what the response will be. We're going to have to add a CAPTCHA. We're going to have to add an SMS verification code. And all of a sudden, your super smooth Web2 experience has like a 4 or 5 step
Yeah,
login process, which completely dwarfs logging in on Web3. And this
I
brings back the idea: how come is Web3 implies more friction when Web2 not only has attack vectors on your identity, because guess what? Now everybody knows who you
mm,
are. But to combat that, they just add another layer and another layer and another layer of login to make
yep.
sure it's safe.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. So, I mean, to trigger warning, this is one of my favorite topics generally as a developer, as a UX, person responsible for UX. I wouldn't call myself a UX person. I use multiple password managers. Why do I have password managers? Well, because to be secure with passwords, you need to have a lot of them and you need to manage it, etc. Why multiple? Well, because you don't want a single point of failure. So for certain things, they're spread across multiple password managers. But then you say, well, okay, Web2 is easy to use. Well, no, it's not, because I have to have multiple pieces of software just to help me manage that experience, right? So that's clearly not that simple. But then on top of that, you get weird and wacky stuff where, like, I mean, it drives me crazy. This is the bit I was going to warn people of, because I get ranty about this. But, some websites like, oh, you can maximum have 8 characters in your password. Or I had a website the other day told me I couldn't have special characters in my password. And it's like, why? It's a maximum of 16 characters and you've limited which they are. You're literally just, speeding up the, number of iterations the brute force attack is going to require until it can crack my password. Like, you're literally just making it easier. Aside from the fact that you're actually getting in the way of the infrastructure I had to bring in just because it's so annoying and difficult to log in with your stuff. So yeah, I've long been a proponent of the idea that, well, actually, no, entering a seed phrase or like retrieving your private key from some deep storage and entering it, I think it seems more difficult to people because, seed phrases and things can be, a bunch of words, or a private key is like a Titanic long, messy string. And so, oh, it's technical and it's confusing, etc. But actually entering that once and having it work is far simpler, really, than managing passwords in a secure way, etc. And okay, if you had thousands of sites operating off keys, then key management would get to be an issue and you'd probably want some software to deal with it. But it's certainly not worse than dealing with passwords, particularly given that they're so flaky that we've inevitably got to have two-factor along with it. And often that becomes 3-factor because they know that the SMS-based thing isn't secure. So you need that and a token generator. And all of a sudden, getting into your GitHub account is a 30-minute affair, right? I mean, GitHub is actually very important for security, more than people think, but it's still like can take a noticeably long time to actually just log in when you get logged out.
Yeah, and when I look at these things, and they want you to create an account and that's your date of birthday, and I'm thinking to myself, why don't you tell me what my birthday is? You obviously already know all this stuff. Why do you make me fill it in? Because I mean, they know everything else. Like, for example, if you're using a VPN, or you travel a lot, and they're like, oh, you're in a different country. Oh no, we have to redo
Mm.
everything from scratch. Who are you protecting with that? I mean, seriously, at which point is this too much? Because it's obviously not helping the hackers, because they obviously can get around all this stuff. But for the normal user, it just becomes more and more painful, and you can get your account temporarily banned or temporarily
Mm.
suspended because you're in the wrong jurisdiction for some reason, or
I get
you
I
filled
get
in the
logged
wrong
out of
captcha.
stuff regularly
Hmm.
because VPN's putting me in a different jurisdiction, which I did so that I could use something that I set up when I was in that jurisdiction. And then you get logged out of something else, which means you're now logging back in, and every time you're logging in and out, etc., you're exposing credentials, etc. So it's definitively making you and them less secure. But yes, you get a lot of ham-fisted security stuff, and I mean, that's just a failure of, passwords are just not a particularly good way. No one in security is like, oh, passwords are a great idea. Um, it's not a very advanced way of doing things. And in the end, I think now it's gotten to the point where, once upon a time when people had password 123 as their password and their email as their username,
Well,
for
you
the
don't use that
free,
anymore? Did people
no, 123
catch on to that one?
4, I mean, security. But like back in the day when like people had 3 things they logged into and none of them were even their email, fine, whatever. Like it really, your GeoCities website was secured with the password, and that was it, and that was okay. But now I think it's that overall is just insufficient. Everybody knows it, and what we've got is this nightmare of patches over that, rather than looking at saying, actually, we have really sophisticated encryption techniques on phones and on tablets and PCs, TCP, like trusted computing environments and all sorts of things where you could do really great key management, where you could set up the laptop to have an ID that it handed onto websites to securely log into them, and you could rotate that when you needed to. Totally possible. But yeah, we're stuck in a world of logins, which unfortunately are just not secure and not a good user experience.
Yeah, I think the way I see it is everything you hate about bureaucracy in the real world, plus the impossibility of actually complaining to a real person. That's for me interacting with Web2. It's
Yeah.
just the worst of both worlds, because it's you're guilty by default, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you have an ad account with Google, you are a way higher class citizen with them than if you're a user with Google, right? Because then someone with a Google Ads account can always complain about something you wrote, let's say a review on Google Maps or something, and get it taken down, or something on YouTube, get it taken down. So you, the user, you're literally the serf. You're like the lowest of the lowest
Mm-hmm.
class. And if you don't enjoy that in the physical world, you know stop using Web 2. Get into Web 3 and become a first class citizen, because obviously that's where we're heading towards this enclosure of, the internet was supposed to be free on open, a blue ocean, and now it's like, no, you have to stay here, you have to
It's
write this.
it's one of those kind of mesmerizing things where I used to work in scientific publishing, and as an open source person in scientific publishing, I was like, this is completely batshit crazy, because in a lot of cases, scientific journals were charging state-funded universities to buy research that was given to the journal by scientists who were paid by the institution that is now buying the research back. And so the journals were in this, the journal publishing houses, the big old ones, were in this position where they were being given research, in some cases paid to publish the research of researchers, and then being paid by the libraries who pay those researchers to buy it back in printed form. And I looked at it, I was like, this is, only the weirdest historical legacy system could exist like this. And yet we're busily creating exactly the same thing for users all over the place, where for the 0.02 cost of storing their, post, that's if it's a significant post. If it's a chat message, it's a tiny fraction of a cent. They're being forced to pay to get their own content back. Having to subscribe and pay for this. And the cost of running these systems is non-trivial, but that's only because there's billions of users. Per user, it's not much at all. But we're still, being forced to either subscribe and pay money, or to hand over all of our rights to all of our data, personal, what we imported and not, just to get access to the stuff that we created in the first place, which I think is kind of mesmerizing, that people would walk into that bear trap again, and be happy with that as an outcome.
I think this is a more nuanced issue, because I don't think people are walking into the bear trap just because they have nothing better to do. I think there's also some examples of virality happening and people
Mm.
having meaningful success, and that acts as a as an ideal for people to aim for, right? So you make sure that 100 people make it really big, and that creates a mimetic desire, and then you get billions of people that ape into it,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you make your money back, right? And it's a very, I mean, it's worth it to push Mr. Beast to 40 million views per video, right, and turn him into this big virality guy. If you can then get millions and millions of children to try and be Mr. Beast, and then you can make your money there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people don't think about this aspect, but Web2 can decide a lot of what you think, a lot of what you value by manufacturing scarcity, by controlling algorithms, the news you consume,
Mm-hmm.
the way you can interact with just one like per post, and so on and so forth. And it's literally, I think it's more of a Trojan horse for some sort
Yeah.
of twisted behavioral economic test of some sort. And I think that at least now Web3 doesn't have anything of that sort.
No, I mean, it's very interesting. I've been playing around with different Web3 platforms and then open internet platforms and things like Fediverse stuff, etc. recently as well, just to, kind of learn from everybody and see where stuff's at, etc. And you're right, there is there is something, if the platform isn't set up to be a laser guided dopamine hit, right into the right part of your brain, because it's, got a team of 50 people working on like on you, like on the thing it's identified that you are, and then trying to trap that. Um, yeah, that is different. And I think that's, we didn't end up with Web2 because it's sandpaper on your skin. We ended up there because, people worked out, yes, you can um, sell these experiences very well, and people will pick them up. I think the appeal really is, if you want something more, it's the McDonald's of website web experiences, right? With a lot of friction and a lot of costs, and there are alternatives. And I think once people start to experience that, they can see the difference. Some of the weirdness is that maybe, like, yes, social media will play a healthier part in people's lives because it isn't so addictive. And there's a question then of, like, how do you win out if you have the less addictive product? But, I think that winning there is a very Silicon Valley concept. It's not, that's not, nobody set up the internet as a competition for that sort of stuff. That's implied, that's sort of imposed on it by people who are trying to make a maximal return on money, and they're trying to use the internet to do it.
Yeah, I think once you get into the whole Silicon Valley part of the situation, I think, I don't know if I've read this or heard it somewhere, but there's this idea going around that what is actually happening with places like Silicon Valley is that you take the most uh, competitive, violent people in the world, and you challenge all that energy into something constructive through capitalism. But for the scale, the sheer scale of the internet, you can end up with like this mammoth company, which are psychopathic in nature. Like
Mm-hmm.
before the internet, these guys would just battle it out on a battlefield. Have a sword fight, whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually one would go away and the other would win, and hurrah, we're better than you. But now it's happening on a global scale, and everybody's becoming kind of like collateral damage in this cockfight between you know a few guys in Silicon Valley and the people who support them.
I've lost you for a second there, Alex. I'm not sure what's up. For the benefit of anyone watching, I'll try and answer the question because I think it's a very interesting one. Alex's screen's locked up for me. I'm not sure if he's speaking right now. I might just check in a side
Am I
channel.
back? I'm back, or yeah.
You're back now, yes.
Yeah, well, it's this is the life of of the open internet. you can have a nice background, but you lose the good internet. So it's but I was saying that these very competitive forces would be limited
Mm.
by their geographic position. But now for the internet, they kind of become this like worldwide cockfight, and then through that whole mechanism, you kind of end up with like billions of people as collateral damage, because it literally
Hmm.
sucks the energy from so many people just so one or two guys can have like the biggest ego, and that's something that we haven't had before. And so it's one of those situations where, if you think about it, it's uncharted territory, and we are dealing with it the best we can. But I think it's a very, very big question.
Yeah, well, I think we've had the behavior before, like you say.
Mm.
Princes would fight for dominion over things. There was colonialism. There've been all sorts of like very destructive, very wide-ranging versions of this stuff. The change is that like digitally it can happen in a far more comprehensive and far quicker way in terms of like population sizes and reach. Um, and so, you know, the levels of destructiveness are maybe different. Well, definitely different. But yeah, I think we are in a weird position where people haven't. One of the things that we do have societally is that people have a sense of social justice, and they have a sense of, you know, that wages should be a minimum. There's like different people have a different picture of what like fair working conditions are, but there's a sense that they should exist. Whereas, yes, like you're saying, your internet surfs, your cloud surfs out there is a role that people are accepting without those social norms. Sort of. Um, remember talking to a doctor that on who was specialized in like narcotic uh, epidemiology, drug misuse, and he talked a lot about like whether or not cultures had social controls for that drug. So like in Europe, you do have alcoholics, but you also have a sense that if your friend is drinking in the morning, there's probably something wrong. Whereas you take alcohol to a place that never had it, and nobody has that idea, right? And so I think we have the same. That's the core of where I see what you're talking about really matters, is we don't have these natural instincts of like, hey, this is really wrong. Like I shouldn't be giving away my labor like this. And it's very slow. I think people are picking up on this stuff now because they're starting to understand, wait, like what's the market cap on these companies and how much money are they making? And I'm happy to get like nothing out of this, or a very small amount. And again, the people are being sold that just through the sort of hope that they'll become one of the chosen few who makes a genuine amount of money. Also, maybe not understanding that who gets to be that person is pretty much decided by the platform in the first place. Um, so, yeah, I think that, yeah. And so I think that's something where I feel like you can really have it. There really is a sense at the moment that people are starting to develop a much broader sense of this, partially because young people are smart and they look at the world around them much more critically than older people, maybe who had it develop around them. But also, I think just growing maturity and awareness of these things, we're starting to develop some social sense of this stuff. But it's taken a long time, and we've essentially been, people in a place where new viruses have turned up and we've had no defense. And so this stuff has happened, and it's infected, like we started off saying, everything. How we perceive these experiences have to be with logins and certain paths for expected user behavior. The idea that there's like a central authority, or even weird stuff, like you said before, it's a really strong point about being guilty until proved innocent. People accept that as a kind of way things are with internet platforms, but not with criminal law. Right. And so why? Well, because we were taught, maybe it was propaganda, but the police procedurals and school textbooks or whatever taught you about these principles of like, this is how the law works. It's fair and stuff. And we don't have that kind of civics teaching or propaganda or whatever when it comes to the internet telling us, well, you should be an equal of the service provider or anything like that.
Yeah, I think there's a broader discussion around education and how The level of education has gone down over the years considerably, and how that also affects people's capacity to understand their rights, or think for themselves and make their own
Well, I think
decisions.
it's the ability to assess new environments and bring your existing set of understandings and mental techniques and stuff up to speed to match the new environment, which is very much a product of, it's not a matter of, I think you're right on something there, because I wouldn't say it's a matter of like training your kids specifically to think about their digital IP rights. It's about teaching people to, when they enter a new situation, to be able to look at it from first principles and say, well, how do I want to be treated in this space, right? And that's really the key.
Exactly, and I think you had this analogy that I always come back to when I try to explain what's happening, and it's you know, would you rather live in the world where you have a lot of stores, different like a street where you only have shoemakers, a street where you have tailors, and a street where you only have coffee shops, or do you want to have like a mall, and there's like two or three chosen chains of coffee shops and one chain of shoes and two, three chains of clothes, and that's it. And now imagine this on a global level.
Mm,
There's like two malls in the whole world, and there's three shoe stores, and there's two coffee shops. Who wants to live in that version of the world? Because that's where we're heading with Web 2.
yeah. Well, I think that's it's a really good point, and I think you can see exactly how that would work, right? So there's going to be exactly enough types of shoe to make sure that people don't just completely lose interest, right? And if you can engineer it so that they have to wear the shoe type, the shoe that fits, because that's all there is, and their feet will be bare otherwise, then that's what you will do in that scenario as the person running the shoe store. And so you get this very minimal provision of what people will accept. So you do have diversity. Facebook went from something for 20 somethings to something for 70 somethings. And so people have moved on to other social platforms, younger people, but there's only enough of them out there, and they get co-opted into the big, Instagram started off as like a wonky photo site based on the fact that everyone had a camera in their pocket all the time, and is now nothing like that at all from my, small experiences of it. And so there's just a set of flavors on the same thing, basically, because that's obviously easier to provide. It's also, guess what, easier to regulate. So the authorities are happy to have that be what they're dealing with, rather than a million independent websites that could be hosted anywhere, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a great analogy, because it explains the kind of great wall of bland that comes at you if this stuff keeps happening.
I think that this image of the wall of bland, I think that's what I would like our audience to take away from today's show,
Enjoy
because
the wall of bland.
in Web 2,
Yeah.
enjoy the wall of bland,
Yeah.
whether it's your feed wall or your Instagram feed, infinite
Mm.
scroll, all that stuff. Eventually, it's one of those experiences where you get like mini dopamine hits, but you don't really remember anything afterwards, and there's no takeaway, literally.
Mm.
And personally, I think that whenever I discover like a new Web3 project or a Web3 website, it always makes me curious, because it's like, oh, wow, this is something that I've never seen before. This is something interesting. And it's always there on the edges that you get to find the most interesting things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think it's a product as well of giving people not just the freedom to do these things, but also a way to showcase them and express them that's not, where they're not just not censored, but they're not self-censoring, right? And so you need to have genuinely open spaces where people can just do those things. You also need things like privacy, so that like, would you have a Banksy if you had to, if you were allowed to register to write on walls around the UK, would Banksy be Banksy if that's what he'd been doing? It's a really important question, I think, and it's certainly exciting to me actually to think about moving away from big platform providers to more peer-to-peer stuff, etc. Partially because there's basically nothing I like to do more than travel. Sometimes to places I've been in many times, and sometimes to places I've never been before. But it's the whole experience of the difference of moving yourself into a different mode of life and a different way of seeing things, etc. And I think we've forgotten the internet can be like that because it's just this wall of bland, right? And it's presented in so few ways. But it should be as 5 times bigger and more diverse and complex than the world. And there should be corners you'll never get to and never find because you just happen not to have been there. I don't know how many corners of Buenos Aires or Reykjavik or Riga or whatever that I've never been to that I would think is the coolest place. And I can, it's an interesting, sad, wonderful thing about life that I can't just get to all of them and etc. But I think actually an internet which had some of that property, right, which was not thoroughly mapped and not well understood across the board and not subject to singular algorithms recommending content, it creates something of an appreciation in what you do find that we don't get otherwise. And I think that's also something that isn't necessarily clear to people about using open platforms, is that they can create open vistas and spaces where you don't have a known bounded experience.
Such a beautiful image and such a beautiful message to round up the episode with. And if you're watching us from Buenos Aires, Reykjavik, or Riga, please write your favorite spot in the
I'll
city
right
so that Richard can come and visit.
If you're in Buenos Aires, hide your stakes because I'm.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for another great episode, Richard, and thank you to everybody who's been watching. Once again, this has been the Open Internet Pod live on X, and of course, you can also follow us on RSS and Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts, of course. Catch you guys next week.